postdoctoral research fellow in ambient literature at the University of the West of England, where she researches the locational and technological future of the book. She has a PhD from the Centre of Cultural Studies, Goldsmiths, where her thesis focused on collaborative authorship in digital literature. Amy is a writer of fiction and non-fiction and is the author of DIY, The Rise of Lo-Fi Culture. And I believe the presentation today will be part of the ambient literature research that you've been doing recently.
Yes.
Great.
Perfect. Great. Thank you very much, Erica. It's been a really enjoyable symposium so far. I'm going to be asking some slightly different questions about language. Language particularly experienced by readers through a mobile kind of reading afforded by digital technology that's rooted in place. I want to think about how story, in particular, rooted in place and accessed using a smartphone, can be not just about reading words on a screen or listen to audio through your ears, but a subtler language found around you, so the language of place, and how the interplay between language, different types of languages, the kind of authored language and the real language of place, can create immersive literary works. So that's going to be the focus of this talk. So my interest in this area has come about through my work with the Ambient Literature project. So Ambient Literature is a 2-year AHRC funded research project, which is a collaboration between UE University in Bristol, where I work, Bath Spa University and the University of Birmingham. So it's this 2-year collaborative project that's just coming to an end shortly. The aim of the project is we are investigating situated literary experiences delivered by pervasive computing platforms responding to the presence of a reader to deliver story. So this was our kind of aim of what we were going to do at the beginning of the project, and it's kind of, I think, still what we think of as a definition of ambient literature. So it's particularly we've been experimenting with using smartphones and all the different kind of sensors in your smartphone. So using GPS sensors, but also some sensors to do with movement. So experimenting how you can create fiction for a smartphone to be experienced in that particular format, and something that a phone as a mobile device that you're moving through space as you're going about your daily life, how you can use that to tell stories. So the presence of the reader is particularly important, that it's your engagement with it that creates story. So it might be that you're in a particular location or you're doing a particular kind of thing, reveals the story. So it's this kind of active participation. So as part of this project, we commissioned 3 literary works. So 3 digital works, each rooted in place, and each needing the reader to be in a physical location or a physical context to deliver the story. So the 3 projects that we have developed, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about. So the first was It Must Have Been Dark by Then by Duncan Speakman. He's a composer and he's produced a lot of theatre pieces, so that was his background coming into it. So this work is a book and an audio experience. It uses music, it uses narration and field recordings to reveal stories of different changing landscapes around the world, from the swamplands of Louisiana to empty Latvian villages and the edge of the Tunisian Sahara. So he, as part of his project, went to these different locations, places where the landscape and the way of life of places was disappearing due to kind of climate change, flooding or erosion, or different difficulties and challenges were facing the people living there and facing the landscape. So he went and recorded interviews with people and tried to document this. As you're experiencing this work, you don't have to be in any particular location. There's no prescribed route that you have to walk on. So you've got a smartphone carrying it with you, but you don't have to go anywhere in particular. You can experience it anywhere in the world. And so the aim was that it would bring you closer to these places that were disappearing as you move through any environment you wanted to. There's no preset route, and the software used builds a unique map for you for your own experience. It's up to you to choose your own path, and the real world kind of interrupts you as you're experiencing it. So I've experienced in a few different locations, but if you were here, you would take your phone, you would put headphones on, you would walk, and it would direct you to walk and find particular features of the landscape, so it wouldn't matter where you were. But in particular, the world around you would kind of interrupt you. You wouldn't be in a vacuum. The world kind of interrupts you and it speaks to you in different ways as you travel. So the second work that we commissioned that came out a little while ago is called Cartographer's Confession, and it's by a writer, he's primarily a travel writer, James Attlee, and it's an exploration of London told through a story of immigration and loss, and explores kind of hidden family stories across the city. And in this one you follow this preset route and you experience real locations, and those are tied to the story. So yeah, it's a really lovely route through London. It takes about 4 hours, I would say, to experience through 3 different locations, and you've got headphones on and you're listening to the story, and you're interacting with your phone as you're doing it. So you've got this kind of duality of you experiencing the story, but also London around you is a feature of the story. And the third work, which came out a couple of months ago, is Breathe by the writer Kate Pullinger, and she's got a long background in digital writing as well as writing fiction, kind of print history as well. So this is a ghost story that's told to you through your phone. It's designed to be experienced in your bedroom, wherever in the world that is. You experience the story through the character of Flo, who's a young woman who's haunted by technology. She's haunted by her phone. And the work and your experience of it leaves space for the real world, your own world, to interrupt you. And that one's one it's a web-based one, but you access it on your phone, so you can go and look at that. Takes about 20 minutes, the experience. There's no audio, it's just a text piece, but there's some kind of movement that you need to do as well, so it interacts with the mechanisms of your phone, or you have to interact with the mechanisms of your phone to experience the fullness of the narrative. So through each of these projects, we've had these 3 projects, we've learnt different things about ambient literature, particularly the types of literary space that's created through different modes of language, kind of different operations of language. So I'm going to briefly look at these types of spaces created by each of the authors, and the presence of the real world, which must be navigated and experienced by the reader. So I'm going to be using these 3 projects as examples to kind of look at this way that language operates. So to begin with, I want you to think about there being 2 forms of language within these projects. So the narrative that's written, crafted and controlled by the author, and the language of the place, so with its inherent uncontrollability and unpredictability. So the author is responsible for creating a story, for crafting a story, so that each of these operates successfully. So whatever that means for them as an author, thinking about the world around you as well as what you're writing. So it's slightly different to the experience of writing print fiction, where you're probably not as concerned about the location that the reader's reading your book in, your print book. You're thinking about what's going on. You're kind of creating something that takes place in context. So this is what I kind of think of it as 2 forms of language. So I'm going to argue that it's the interplay between these 2 forms of language, so this constructed language and the language of place, that contributes to this immersive literary experience. The reader needs to read the place that they're in, read the context of the place as well as the story, and an author of an ambient work can use both of these types of language. So there's this kind of balancing of languages. So to start with, I'm going to think about how unpredictability can be read and how it can be considered a form of language in ambient literature. It's parallel to the narrative, that's been authored, that's been written by the author, but I think it's an integral part of the experience. So it can be read as part of a narrative. As works of ambient literature respond to the presence of the reader to deliver the story, this sense of unpredictability is inherent in this literary form. So neither the world nor the people within it often behave in predictable ways. So this is a feature of this new type, type of situated literature, which isn't necessarily new, but it is a kind of key feature of a way of thinking about it. So when I experienced one of our early prototypes of a work of ambient literature at the start of the project, I began to think about this as a kind of language. So I was listening to a story that one of our team had created through headphones, and I was sitting on a bench. The narrative instructed me to go to a place and look at a river, so there was a nearby river, so I sat and looked at the river, and I had these big headphones on, and a stranger approached me and asked for spare change, so I took my headphones off and kind of engaged with the person, But with the headphones on, I felt kind of separated and muffled. You know, the sound was in my ears, like I wasn't engaged with the world. But as soon as I took the headphones off, I was kind of jolted back into the real world and engaging with somebody. And I could return to the story just by simply putting the headphones back on again, and the audio would start again. But this kind of jolting experience jolted me out of the narrative, and I realised that was became part of the story, became part of the narrative, that the world was close by, and that was part of it. And as I was listening, I was watching, you know, people on the river, I was watching people walking by, and that was a language that was being used, that was part of the narrative. It wasn't something particularly separate. So such spontaneous interruptions influence the way the narrative's experienced, and these are often fragmented and ephemeral. As you experience a work of ambient literature, a cyclist might pass by and pass too close to you, or a car might kind of, if you're not paying attention as you're walking around with your headphones on, that, you know, you could get run over. So you have to be aware of the world around you. You might be interrupted when you're reading a printed work, but the interruption isn't really the same. You might note a disturbance, but you look at it and go back to what you're doing. It's not as, the experience isn't as immediate, I would say. So in a work of ambient literature, the boundaries of the narrative are less fixed. Instead of being printed on the pages of a book, held in your hands, it's a slightly more nebulous experience, and the edges of the story and reality kind of blur and mix together. The language of the printed word is not the same as the language of the physical world around you. The reading process is mobile and the book is unbound. There are not restrictions imposed by a bound narrative, and there are fewer material constraints. Duncan Speakman, the author of one of our works, the first one that we produced, often talks about letting the world in, so leaving space for serendipity, which changes the experience of the reader. And I see this serendipity as a type of language, so unauthored, but definitely part of it. So for example, in Duncan Speakman's work, It Must Have Been Dark by Then, he leads you through the voice of the narrator, which you're listening to through headphones, and he asks you to go and find a place where you see something growing. So you might find a shoot of a little root of a plant, or you might walk towards a tree surviving within the city, so you're looking for something, and then you notice a piece of nature, and it feels somehow as though it's you've been prompted to do it, but it feels like a revelation in the narrative. You think, because you often experience this work in a city, and you're asked to find some nature, and you think, oh, I'm not going to find it in a concrete landscape, and then you might see like a daffodil peeking up through the tarmac, and you have this moment of realization that maybe it was kind of put there for you. In the way that he crafts it, it kind of feels like that. Where did I get to? Yeah, so there's a moment of noticing, and these two kind of languages connect for a moment, the language of the world around you and the language of the narrative. So there's this kind of connection. So Duncan Speakman's specific interests in developing his work generally are thinking about how the lines between the author and the reader, or the performer and the audience, how they blur, and particularly how they blur in these uncontrollable environments. So for example, in a story told through an audio work, where the author is unable to know what the person's going to be encountering, what they're going to be experiencing as they move through a physical place. So he leaves room for these interruptions from a passerby, an unexpected encounter, or a strange sight. And the technology might fail, the GPS might not work, so he leaves room for these kind of interruptions, the space for the language of the story to enter. So not just his written story, but the world. The experience for the reader is as though there are stories in the air waiting to be discovered. When told as ambient literature, the stories have a temporal rather than a physical frame. They appear and they disappear, so the world around you kind of comes in, it comes out of focus. They might be authored, or they might be what you as the reader experience for yourself during an encounter with place. So in many ways it's similar to a performance away from a traditional theatre space and into a public space. So in such performances, the real world location becomes part of the fictional story, and the edges overlap, but only for a specific amount of time, and then everything kind of goes back to the way it was before. Yeah, so once the performance is over, the everyday reappears, and the story fades into the background, and only the kind of resonance, only the memory of the story remains. The language of the place interrupts and plays with a sense of authorial control. And this is the second aspect that I want to consider. So in an ambient work, an author needs to relinquish a kind of degree of control over their narrative, as they leave room for external features such as the influence of the physical environment and these chance encounters such as an interruption from a passerby. There's a potential for authors to leave space for the world to enter in interesting ways. So this unpredictability isn't really something that's separate from the ambient literary work, but instead it's part of it, and it offers opportunities, kind of exciting opportunities for experimentation as we test the boundaries of literature, testing the boundaries of what's within the text and what's outside the text, or what's inside the narrative and what's outside the narrative. This can be seen particularly in our second work that we produced. So this is the Cartographer's Confession, which is by writer James Attlee. So this work spans London, and you as a reader are prompted to pass through streets guided by audio, text and maps, which are revealed on your phone as you pass through certain locations. However, a reader physically navigating a city space can't be controlled. Neither the world nor people in it are predictable, as I've mentioned. The reader must be physically present in a location, but this is part of the narrative that the author can't really control. So it's part of their authorial territory, but as they might not know what the reader sees in front of them, uncontrollable events can become unexpected features, a form of language that the author can play with. So such experimentations and interventions require a rethinking of authorial control and of the reading experience. So an author needs to kind of relinquish some of the control and leave room for these different aspects of the physical environment, the language of the physical environment. There's potential for writers to leave space for the world to enter, as Duncan Speakman has said, in interesting ways. This influences the reading process, as the reader reads the context or situation that they're in and read the experiences of the place, and that becomes part of the narrative. It becomes the language of the narrative. So when a reader experiences an ambient form, they're asked to simultaneously navigate both a physical and an imaginative world, while at the same time being embodied in a narrative. This embodiment as a result of the interplay between the two languages. There's an orchestrated experience for the room for the world to enter, and a space for the reader to draw connections. This involves careful authorship and understanding of how we can challenge and reshape the act of reading by developing new techniques. So I want to think about that, the idea of using ambient materials from the world around you to build this work. And in my research I've drawn on examples from the work of Malcolm McCulloch and Ulrich Schmidt, and using these ideas of, particularly the idea of distraction and immersion. You can view readers' experiences of work as being part of this, that the reader is in a physical space, but their attention is drawn away from the text, drawn away from the narrative, to the physical features of the environment. So they're kind of brought in and out of the narrative. So in Kate Pullinger's work, Breathe, the authored language and the language of place are used quite subtly. The reader is physically located in their own bedroom or a location of their choosing, and the story knows where this is through GPS technology, and it responds, includes details of I don't want to say too much about it, but it includes details within the narrative. And it, as a ghost story, the reader begins to experience a sense of being haunted. So some of the technology in the phone kind of plays with the idea of your location. And in Duncan Speakman's work, the reader's attention can be orchestrated using ambient materials and different languages. The fabric of the city street is used alongside pervasive technologies. The reader navigates a space and their attention is drawn to different elements. So your attention is kind of drawn to, for example, a piece of nature, an element of nature in the city, and then it's kind of brought back. So there's this kind of orchestration using ambient materials. So you're in one place, but you're also in another, and you're kind of brought between the two, and it's a material that the reader gets to experience. Yeah, so features are highlighted into the reader's attention, and then brought. There's this kind of interplay between what's in the foreground and what's in the background, and you're kind of brought between the two. The reader's attention can dissolve in two opposite directions, so towards a lack of concentration or towards an absorbed trance. So you're brought in and you're brought out again as they navigate the space. This playing with attention in multiple ways highlights these two languages, so they become a feature of ambient literature. Authors can use such techniques to construct experiences for the reader. So in Duncan Speakman's work, we're drawn into the physical environment, and then we're shifted to thinking about another place located further away. So as he's playing with the idea of disappearing landscapes, you're in one location, but in your mind you've moved to another location. So multiple locations and the interplays between them exist at the same time for the reader. In James Attlee's project, The Cartographer's Confession, the narrative is interrupted by the language of physical locations. So by the need to search for the next place where the fragment of the story is revealed. So as you're moving through London, you're asked to find the next location, and as you're walking, different pieces of text or audio or maps are triggered onto the phone in front of you or into your headphones. So you're kind of you're kind of drawn between these two places. And in Kate Pullinger's project, the story includes elements of the real world, so the language of home is part of the story. So we can see that the construction and interplay of language is part of ambient literature. This is not only the language of the authored narrative and what happens in the narrative, its literary frame. Interruptions, interactions with place, encounters and unexpected features of the landscape become part of the work. So it's not just about what's authored, but it's about what's experienced, and those are particularly different forms of language. We can tell as much of the story through these experiences with landscape, with place, as we can from the authored experience. The language is often uncontrollable and unpredictable, but it can be used to create immersive experiences for readers who are challenged to read the language of context and situation and place, as well as the written word. Okay. Thank you.